What if the Anunnaki didn't leave Earth because their work was finished? What if they fled because something here terrified them? Something they had created, or something they had awakened, or something that was coming? In the dry heat of southern Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates once cradled the first cities humanity remembers, clay tablets rest in museum basements across the world. Their cuneiform impressions, pressed into wet clay 5,000 years ago, still carry fragments of a story we've barely begun to decode. A story of departure, of urgency, of gods who abandoned their creation and never returned. So before this story pulls you under, if you're drawn to histories that blur the line between myth and memory, settle in. The word Anunnaki appears in the earliest Sumerian texts we possess, inscribed on clay tablets that date back nearly 5,000 years, and its meaning has been debated by scholars for over a century, passed and repassed through the filters of Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian adaptations. But at its core, the term seems to denote something like princely offspring of Anu, or those of royal seed who descended. And in one interpretation that has gained traction among alternative researchers, though it remains outside mainstream academic consensus, the word breaks down into component parts, suggesting those who from heaven to earth came, a phrase that transforms these beings from abstract deities into something more concrete, more physical, entities who traveled from somewhere else to this place we call home. The texts that preserve their memory are scattered across museums worldwide. The clay tablets baked hard by time and fire, and the most significant among them include the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic discovered in the ruins of Nineveh in the 19th century, the Atrahasis epic that predates the biblical flood narrative by at least 1,000 years, and countless cylinder seals. Those small stone cylinders carved with intricate scenes that were rolled across wet clay to leave impressions showing the gods in their various activities, seated on thrones, descending from the sky, interacting with human supplicants who appear notably smaller in scale. Let your breathing slow as we enter this ancient world. Feel your body settling deeper into wherever you rest tonight, because the story we are exploring has waited millennia to be told again. And it will wait a little longer if your consciousness drifts between waking and sleep. The pantheon these texts describe is hierarchical and complex, a divine bureaucracy with clear chains of command. At the apex sits Anu, whose name simply means heaven or sky, the father of the gods who ruled from his celestial throne and rarely descended to earth, preferring to govern through his children and subordinates. Below Anu came his sons, most prominently Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Command and who served as the chief executive on earth, the stern administrator who maintained order among both gods and the humans they would eventually create. And Enki, also called Ea in later Babylonian texts. The Lord of Wisdom and Fresh Waters, the clever scientist and diplomat of the divine family, whose domain was the Abzu, now the primordial freshwater ocean believed to exist beneath the earth. Alongside these primary deities stood Ninhursag, the mother goddess, birth goddess, the divine specialist in biological creation and reproduction, known by various names across different periods and city-states, including Ninmah, Nintu, and Mami, but always recognizable by her function as the shaper of life, the one who could mold clay into flesh and breathe existence into new forms of being. These four formed the core of what the Sumerians called the Great Gods, but they were not alone. Below them served a vast host of divine beings, divided into two primary categories that the texts carefully distinguish. The Anunnaki proper, the princely gods, the decision-makers who sat in the divine council and determined the fates of heaven and earth, and the Igigi, a term whose etymology remains debated, but which clearly refers to a lower class of gods, the workers, the laborers, the divine proletariat, who would eventually rebel against their burdensome tasks and set in motion the chain of events that led to humanity's creation. The physical descriptions of these beings scattered throughout the texts are tantalizing and strange. They are described as towering figures, their stature exceeding that of ordinary humans by significant measure, and they emanate what the Sumerians called melamu, a supernatural radiance or aura that marked their divine nature, a luminosity so intense that humans could not bear to look upon them directly without protection or preparation. Their lifespans extended across spans that the Sumerian king list records in thousands and tens of thousands of years. Whether these figures represent literal lifespans or symbolic designations of eras remains one of the great interpretive questions, but the texts themselves present them as matter-of-fact accountings, the way a bureaucrat might record any other administrative detail. And then there is the question of their origin, the place from which they descended. Later, Babylonian astronomical texts make reference to a celestial body called Nibiru, a word that translates roughly as crossing point or ferryboat, referring to something that crosses or transits through the heavens. In traditional academic interpretation, Nibiru refers to a star or planet that marks a crossing point in the sky, possibly Jupiter, possibly an asterism associated with the spring equinox. But in the alternative interpretation most famously articulated by the late Zecharia Sitchin in his 1976 book, The 12th Planet, Nibiru represents the homeworld of the Anunnaki, a planet on an extreme elliptical orbit that brings it through the inner solar system every 3,600 years, allowing its inhabitants to travel between worlds during the periods of closest approach. This interpretation is rejected by mainstream Assyriology and astronomy alike, scholars pointing out that Sitchin's translations are idiosyncratic at best, that no such planet has been detected despite our increasingly sophisticated observations of the outer solar system, that the physics of such an orbit would be problematic. And yet, the idea persists, not because the evidence is compelling in a scientific sense, but because it provides a framework for reading these ancient texts more literally, for taking seriously the repeated insistence that the gods came down from heaven, that they arrived from somewhere beyond the earth, that they were visitors here rather than metaphysical abstractions invented to explain natural phenomena. Whether you find such interpretation plausible or fanciful, the texts themselves remain, preserved in clay, waiting to be read and reread by each generation, and the questions they raise about human origins and divine purpose continue to resonate across the millennia. The Atrahasis epic opens not with creation, but with crisis, not with the ordering of the cosmos, but with the breakdown of divine labor relations. And this unusual beginning reveals something essential about the Sumerian understanding of why humanity exists at all. When the gods, instead of man, did the work and bore the loads, the text declares, "The gods' load was too great, the work too hard, the trouble too much. For 40 years, or perhaps 40 was a symbolic number meaning simply a very long time, the Igigi gods had been engaged in backbreaking labor, digging the channels of the rivers, dredging the Tigris and Euphrates, excavating the irrigation canals that would transform the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia into fertile agricultural territory. And beyond even this, they were mining, extracting precious materials from the depths of the earth in a region the texts call the Abzu. In its primary meaning, Abzu refers to the freshwater ocean believed to exist beneath the Earth's surface, the domain of Enki. But some alternative researchers have noted that if the term is interpreted geographically rather than cosmologically, it might point toward a physical location. And Sitchin controversially proposed that the mining operations described in these texts took place in southeastern Africa, a region that does in fact contain some of the oldest gold mines on Earth, with geological evidence of mining activity extending back tens of thousands of years. This remains highly speculative, unsupported by mainstream archaeology or linguistics, but it raises an interesting question regardless of its validity. Why would gods need to mine at all, and why specifically would they need gold? The texts do not explain this directly. They state that mining occurred, that it was arduous, that the gods grew exhausted and resentful, but they do not elaborate on what the extracted materials were used for, leaving a lacuna that invites speculation. Gold is chemically unusual, nearly indestructible, an excellent conductor of electricity and heat, reflective of radiation. And some have proposed that an advanced technological civilization might require substantial quantities for purposes we can only guess at: atmospheric modification, energy transmission, computational systems, or applications entirely beyond our current understanding. This is conjecture built on conjecture, but the emptiness in the ancient texts creates a space where such conjecture can flourish. What we know for certain is what happened next. The Igigi, exhausted beyond endurance, watching their superiors, the Anunnaki, live in comfort while they toiled ceaselessly, finally reached their breaking point. They gathered at the gate of Enlil's temple, the stern commander who had assigned them this work, and they did something unprecedented. They burned their tools. This was not merely a strike, but a ritual act of defiance, a symbolic destruction of the instruments of their oppression. They refused to work another day. Enlil, whose character across these texts is consistently authoritarian and easily offended, was furious. He wanted to punish the rebels severely, to make brutal examples of the ringleaders, to crush the uprising with overwhelming force. But Enki, always the diplomat, always the problem solver, proposed an alternative. If the Igigi would not do the work, then create new beings who would. Design a creature specifically for labor, intelligent enough to follow instructions and use tools, but mortal, limited, controllable in ways the divine Igigi were not. Let there be a primitive worker, Enki declared to the assembled gods. Let him bear the yoke of the gods. Let man assume the drudgery of the god. The proposal was accepted. The divine council authorized the creation project. And Ninhursag, the birth goddess, working in collaboration with Enki, began the process of fashioning humanity. The procedure, as described in the texts, has an almost clinical quality, reading less like religious mythology and more like a technical protocol. A god must be slaughtered, one with intelligence, one with the quality the Sumerians called temu, the capacity for understanding. His blood and flesh are mixed with clay from the Abzu, creating a substance that combines terrestrial matter with divine essence. This mixture is divided into 14 portions, 7 for males and 7 for females, and these are implanted into the wombs of 14 birth goddesses who will serve as surrogates. After a gestation period, the first humans are born, specifically designed and engineered to take over the labor the gods refused to perform. We were made to be workers. The texts do not shy away from this uncomfortable truth. They state it plainly, repeatedly. Humanity was created with a purpose, and that purpose was servitude. The gods celebrate this achievement with a feast, relieved that the labor problem has been solved, and the first humans are put to work in the fields and mines that the Igigi had abandoned. The system seems to function as intended, but already seeds of future trouble are being planted, for the created beings are more than mere automatons. They carry within them something of the slaughtered god whose blood gave them life. They possess temu, intelligence, understanding. They can reason and feel and dream. And such beings rarely remain content with servitude forever. For a time, perhaps centuries or millennia in their telling, a golden age prevailed, a period when gods and humans coexisted in something resembling harmony, when the divine beings walked openly among their creations, when the temples were not empty structures waiting for occasional manifestation, but living habitations where the gods took up residence and received the offerings and service they required. The humans multiplied as they were designed to do, spreading across the fertile lands between the rivers, building the first cities that would grow into Eridu and Uruk and Ur, establishing the patterns of civilization that would echo down through all subsequent human history. The gods presided over this development with varying degrees of involvement, Enki teaching the arts of civilization through emissaries called the Abgalu, or Apkalu, fish-cloaked sages who appeared from the waters to instruct humanity in writing and mathematics and medicine and law. Enlil maintaining order through temples and priesthoods that regulated social behavior according to divine decree. Ninhursag overseeing the biological development of the species she had helped design. But something began to shift during this period, something the texts hint at without fully explaining. Some of the divine beings, the texts record using later Hebrew terminology that may derive from these older Mesopotamian sources, saw that the daughters of men were fair and took them as wives. The interbreeding between gods and humans produced offspring that the later tradition would call Nephilim, a word whose meaning is debated, but which seems to relate to falling, or perhaps to giants, beings of unusual stature and capability, heroes of old and men of renown as the Hebrew text describes them, as though their fame had persisted across centuries of retelling. What the Sumerian texts themselves say about this interbreeding is fragmentary and difficult to interpret, but the parallel with the later biblical account is striking enough to suggest a common tradition. Their shared memory of a time when the boundaries between divine and human became permeable in ways that would have consequences. Perhaps the gods enjoyed their hybrid children. Perhaps some of the Anunnaki saw in humanity not just useful workers, but potential companions, mates, even equals. But not all of the divine council approved of this development. The population of humans grew rapidly, far more rapidly than might have been intended, and their noise, the texts say, their commotion and clamor rose up to the heavens and disturbed the gods, particularly Enlil, who could not rest. The word used for this disturbance is huburu, and while it is often translated as noise, some scholars suggest it implies something more than mere sound, perhaps social chaos, perhaps moral corruption, or perhaps simply the unbearable vitality of a species reproducing beyond any planned parameters. Whatever it meant, Enlil was troubled by it. Plans began to form in the divine council. Measures would need to be taken. Humanity had served its purpose, but humanity was also becoming something more than had been intended, more numerous, more capable, more intertwined with the gods themselves through blood and relationship. A decision was coming, and when it came, nothing would be the same. Let yourself breathe deeply now, feeling your chest rise and fall in the ancient rhythm that connects you to every human who has ever lived, every ancestor who slept beneath these same stars, wondering about the same questions we still ask tonight. If you have drifted in and out of waking, that is perfect. That is exactly as it should be. The story will be here when you return to it, patient as clay, patient as the stars the Sumerians tracked with such devoted precision. Something was about to happen in the world they described, something that would separate the time before from the time after. And when we continue, we will explore what the texts tell us about that transition, that rupture, that moment when the gods looked upon what they had made and chose to leave. The flood is the hinge upon which everything turns. And yet, when we examine the ancient accounts with fresh eyes, something deeply strange emerges from the cuneiform impressions that describe those catastrophic days. We have been taught to read the flood as punishment, as divine retribution for human wickedness, or noise, or overpopulation. But what if we have been reading it backwards all along? What if the flood was not the goal, but the cover? Not the punishment, but the distraction. Not divine judgment, but divine evacuation dressed in the clothes of cosmic justice. Let your breathing slow as we descend into these troubling waters, into texts that reveal something the standard narrative has obscured for millennia. In the Atrahasis epic, that ancient Babylonian account dating to approximately 1700 BCE and drawing on even older Sumerian sources, the flood sequence contains details that scholars have puzzled over for generations without fully reckoning with their implications. The text tells us that when the storm came, when the waters began to rise and the world descended into chaos, the gods did not watch from comfortable celestial thrones with the detached satisfaction of judges executing righteous sentence. Instead, something far stranger occurred. The gods ascended to the heaven of Anu, the highest celestial realm, and there, according to the ancient scribes, they cowered like dogs crouched against the outer wall. Read that again in your mind. The gods, the Anunnaki, the powerful beings who had created humanity, who had ruled the earth, who commanded the forces of nature itself, they crouched like frightened animals against a wall. They wept. The goddess Ishtar, queen of heaven, cried out in anguish over the destruction. But her anguish seems to exceed what we would expect from a deity who had participated in planning this very catastrophe. The text preserves her lament, in which she questions how she could have spoken evil in the assembly of the gods, how she could have ordered destruction of her people. But here is what troubles careful readers of these texts. If the gods planned the flood, if they decreed it in their divine council, if this was their judgment executed according to their will, why were they afraid? Why did they cower? Why did they weep and wail and press themselves against walls like refugees, fleeing a disaster they did not anticipate? The emotional register is entirely wrong for executioners watching their sentence carried out. This is the emotional register of beings who are themselves in danger, who are fleeing something, who found temporary shelter but remained terrified of what raged outside. Consider what the text tells us about their behavior during those 7 days and 7 nights of deluge. They did not sit in judgment. They did not observe with cool divine detachment. They went hungry. The text explicitly states, because they had no offerings, no food brought by their human servants. They who had been fed and cared for by humanity were suddenly bereft, cut off, dependent on whatever provisions they had brought with them in their hasty ascent. This is not the behavior of gods in control. This is the behavior of evacuees who barely made it out in time. And if we sit with this possibility, if we allow ourselves to read the flood narrative, not as divine punishment, but as hasty divine evacuation, other details begin to cohere differently. Enlil, the stern god who insisted that humanity must be destroyed, perhaps he was not motivated by righteous anger at human noise disturbing his sleep as the surface narrative suggests. Perhaps he was motivated by the knowledge that something was coming, something that would devastate the earth regardless of divine will, and he saw an opportunity to abandon the human experiment under cover of natural catastrophe. Perhaps his insistence was not destroy them, but we must leave and we cannot take them with us. Enki, who warned Atrahasis and preserved human survival, perhaps his intervention was not mere divine favoritism or gentle rebellion against his brother Enlil. Perhaps Enki understood that abandoning humanity entirely would waste millennia of work, would sacrifice an experiment that might yet prove valuable, would squander genetic material that had taken countless generations to develop. His famous warning to Atrahasis, delivered by speaking to a reed wall rather than to the man directly, perhaps this was not mere clever circumvention of a divine oath. Perhaps it was the desperate measure of a being who had very little time, who could not openly reveal what he knew, who managed only to preserve one small seed of what they were leaving behind. Think about what this reframing means. The flood becomes not a story of divine judgment, but a story of divine abandonment covered by natural disaster. The gods did not send the flood as punishment. The gods fled because something was coming that would cause the flood, or cause something even worse, and they used the catastrophe as cover for their departure. They could not simply vanish, could not simply abandon their temples and their worshippers without explanation. But a flood that destroyed everything, that killed almost all of humanity, that reset the world to near wilderness, such a catastrophe would explain their absence. The survivors would assume the gods were angry. The survivors would tell stories of divine punishment for human wickedness. The survivors would never suspect that they had simply been left behind. Now let your body settle deeper. Let your breath find its natural rhythm as we turn from the flood itself to what came after. Because the departure was not instantaneous. It unfolded over time, over generations, and the ancient scribes documented it with the precision of witnesses who did not fully understand what they were recording, but knew it mattered. The lament texts of ancient Mesopotamia are among the most haunting documents in human literature. The lament for Ur, the lament for Sumer, and Ur, the lament for Nippur. These compositions, dating to roughly 2000 BCE, describe the destruction of great cities and the departure of their divine patrons in language that aches across 4 millennia. The goddess Ningal weeps for her city of Ur, abandoned, destroyed, emptied of its people. But read carefully and you notice something. The laments describe the gods leaving their temples, abandoning their sacred dwelling places, departing to destinations unnamed. The destruction follows the departure, not the other way around. The gods do not leave because the cities are destroyed. The cities are destroyed because the gods have left. This sequence matters profoundly. If the gods left because their cities were conquered, because invaders overwhelmed their worshippers, we would expect the destruction first and the departure second. But the laments consistently describe the divine departure as preceding or causing the catastrophe. The goddess withdrew her protection. The god abandoned his sanctuary. And then, only then, did the walls fall and the fires burn and the people scatter. Temple inventories from this period tell their own strange story. Archaeological excavations have recovered administrative tablets listing the contents of temple treasuries, the precious objects that belonged to the gods, the ritual implements and divine statues and sacred furniture that filled the sanctuaries. In some temples, we find evidence of careful removal. The divine statue is gone, but the pedestal remains. The offering vessels are missing, but the altars stand empty. The ritual objects have vanished, but their storage niches remain carved into the walls. This is not the pattern of conquest and looting. Invaders do not carefully remove divine statues while leaving the architecture intact. Invaders smash and burn and take what they can carry. What these temple inventories suggest is organized withdrawal, divine relocation, the gods taking their belongings and departing in orderly fashion while their human servants watched in bewilderment. The Era and Isham epic, dating to approximately the 8th century BCE, but drawing on older traditions, describes exactly this phenomenon. Marduk, the great god of Babylon, announces that he must leave his temple, must descend to the Apsu for purification of his cult statue, must be absent for a time. But his absence triggers chaos. The city falls into disorder. The protective presence that had maintained cosmic balance is withdrawn, and everything begins to unravel. What makes this text remarkable is its acknowledgement that divine absence is catastrophic, that the gods were not merely symbolic presences, but active maintaining forces whose withdrawal had immediate and devastating consequences. And between the lines, we can read the memory of that withdrawal, the lived experience of a generation that had known divine presence and then experienced its cessation. The priesthoods struggled to maintain their rituals in empty temples. They continued the offerings, the prayers, the sacred calendars, but the gods no longer answered. The oracles fell silent. The dreams stopped coming. The divine manifestations that had punctuated sacred time for centuries simply ceased. We have tablets from these periods expressing priestly confusion and despair. Why does the god not answer? Why do the omens conflict? Why do the rituals fail to produce their expected effects? The scribes who wrote these tablets did not understand that they were documenting an evacuation. They interpreted divine silence as divine anger, as punishment for unknown sins, as temporary withdrawal that would surely end once proper propitiation was offered. They waited for return. They waited for centuries. If you have drifted, that is perfect. Let these ideas settle like sediment, layer upon layer. The story continues whether you follow every word or float in the spaces between. Now we must turn to perhaps the most troubling evidence, the astronomical tablets that seem to record not just celestial observations, but celestial urgency. The Babylonians were the greatest astronomers of the ancient world. Their observations of planetary movements, their predictions of eclipses, their tracking of stars and constellations achieved a precision that would not be matched in the Western world until the Renaissance. They developed sophisticated mathematical models to predict celestial events decades or centuries in advance. They maintained continuous observational records spanning hundreds of years. And their tablets, thousands of them, reflect a culture of calm, systematic observation. The stars move according to predictable patterns. The planets trace their courses through the zodiac. Eclipses occur at calculable intervals. The heavens are orderly, and careful observation reveals that order. This makes certain tablets all the more troubling, because scattered among the methodical astronomical records are tablets with a different tone entirely. Tablets that speak of strange stars. Tablets that record wandering lights that do not behave like planets. Tablets that seem to preserve not calm observation, but urgent warning. The Mule Apin series, a compendium of astronomical knowledge compiled around the 7th century BCE from much older sources, contains references to celestial phenomena that do not fit neatly into the regular astronomical categories. Stars that appear where no stars should be. Objects that move differently than the known planets. Phenomena that the scribes recorded carefully but could not fully explain within their existing frameworks. Some scholars interpret these as comets, as novae, as unusual but natural astronomical events. And perhaps they are correct. But other tablets contain language that suggests something more. References to celestial objects that were watched not with scientific curiosity, but with fear. Objects whose movements were tracked not to advance astronomical knowledge, but to anticipate disaster. Objects that the gods themselves had warned about, whose approach signaled the time to leave. One tablet from Nineveh, fragmentary and damaged, contains what appears to be a warning about something approaching from a specific region of the sky. The language is technical, astronomical, precise. But the emotional register is urgent in a way that routine astronomical texts are not. This is not a prediction of an eclipse to be recorded in the official chronicles. This is something closer to an evacuation alert, a notification that whatever was coming had crossed some critical threshold. The timing interests us particularly. Many of these unusual astronomical references cluster around specific historical periods. The centuries around 2000 BCE, when the Sumerian civilization collapsed. The centuries around 1200 BCE, when the Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean all fell nearly simultaneously. The centuries around 500 BCE, when major religious and philosophical transformations swept across the entire known world, from Greece to India to China. At each of these pivot points, we find astronomical records suggesting unusual celestial activity. We find cultural memories of divine departure or divine transformation. We find the sense that something cosmic was shifting, that the relationship between heaven and earth was being reorganized. Consider what the patterns suggest. If the Anunnaki departure was linked to astronomical events, if they left because something was approaching or arriving or passing through, If their evacuation was timed to celestial cycles beyond human control, then the flood was not cause, but symptom. The flood was what happened to the earth when those celestial forces arrived. The gods knew it was coming. They prepared their departure. They used the catastrophe as cover for abandoning a project that could not survive what approached. But even this explanation may not account for everything. Because the texts suggest that even the gods, even the Anunnaki, with all their knowledge and power and celestial origins, were afraid of what was coming. They crouched like dogs against walls. They wept. They went hungry in their celestial refuges. Whatever drove them from Earth was not something they had fully planned for. It was not a routine orbital return to a homeworld. It was flight, hurried and frightened, from forces that even they could not control. And when they left behind a world in ruins, a humanity reduced to scattered survivors, a silence where divine voices had spoken for millennia. They left behind temples that would stand empty, priests who would continue rituals without response, believers who would wait for return that perhaps was never intended. They left behind stories, fragmentary and distorted over time, but preserving the essential truth. The gods were here. The gods departed. And their departure was not peaceful, was not planned, was not the serene conclusion of a cosmic mission. It was flight. It was fear. It was the abandonment of everything they had built here. The questions multiply in the darkness. What did they flee from? Did it arrive, or did they escape in time? Is it still out there, cycling through vast celestial distances, approaching once more? Will they return when it has passed? Or are they gone forever, leaving only these fragments, these tablets, these empty temples, these myths that are perhaps not myths at all, but memories of the time when the gods walked among us, and then, in panic, fled? Now we arrive at the question that haunts every reading of these ancient texts, the question that hovers unspoken in museum galleries and academic conferences, and the quiet hours of late-night research, the question that once you ask it, you cannot unask. Why did they leave? Not merely that they departed, because the texts are clear on that point. The gods withdrew. The divine presence that had walked among humanity for countless generations simply ceased. But why did that departure carry the quality of urgency, of haste, perhaps even of fear that certain passages seem to preserve? Let your body settle deeper now. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm, because we are entering territory where certainty dissolves and multiple possibilities shimmer, like heat mirages over ancient desert sands, each one plausible, each one troubling in its own way, none of them fully disprovable, all of them carrying implications that echo forward through millennia to touch our present moment. The first possibility, and perhaps the most unsettling because it implicates us directly, is that the experiment failed. Not in the way described in the Enki and Ninmah texts we explored earlier, not through physical defects or biological malfunction, but through something far more profound. Consider the trajectory of the creation narrative across the full corpus of Mesopotamian literature. The Anunnaki create humanity as a labor force, as servants to bear the burden the gods no longer wish to carry, as biological tools designed for a specific purpose. The early humans fulfill this function adequately. They work the fields, they dig the canals, they mine the metals the gods require. The system operates as intended, creators above, creations below, hierarchy maintained, purpose served. but something changes. The texts describe it in terms that sound almost like a laboratory report, noting unexpected results. Humanity begins to multiply, to spread, to fill the earth in numbers the gods did not anticipate. The Atrahasis epic describes Enlil, the chief god on earth, growing increasingly disturbed by human population growth, by the noise humanity makes, by the sheer overwhelming presence of this species that was meant to be manageable, controllable, limited. The noise is often interpreted metaphorically as complaints or prayers or demands on divine attention. But what if it represents something else? What if the noise was not sound but signal, evidence of human activity that exceeded design specifications, creativity and innovation, and communication and organization happening faster and more extensively than the creators expected? We explored earlier how the gods attempted to limit human population through plague, through drought, through famine, each attempt foiled by Enki, who protected his creation. But there is another limitation described in the texts that succeeded, one so fundamental we rarely think about its strangeness: the reduction of human lifespan. Before the flood, according to both Mesopotamian and biblical traditions, humans lived for vast stretches of time. The Sumerian king list records antediluvian rulers reigning for thousands of years. Genesis describes patriarchs living 800–900 years. After the flood, these lifespans drop dramatically and continue declining until they reach what we now consider normal human limits. The texts present this as divine decree, as punishment or necessity, as simple fact of the post-flood world. But consider it from a design perspective. If you had created a being that was becoming problematic, that was developing in ways you had not intended, that was perhaps becoming too capable too quickly, one way to limit its potential would be to shorten its lifespan. A being that lives 30 years cannot accumulate the knowledge and wisdom of a being that lives 300. A species with short generations cannot pass forward experience and learning with the same fidelity as a species with long ones. Each early death resets the counter, forces the next generation to relearn what the previous generation knew, prevents the accumulation of understanding that might eventually rival that of the creators themselves. This reading suggests that the lifespan reduction was not punishment, but population control, not consequence, but intervention, a deliberate hobbling of human potential after it became clear that potential was greater than anticipated. But even shortened lifespans could not contain what had already been released, because something else had happened, something the texts describe with a mixture of fascination and horror, something that changed the very nature of humanity. The interbreeding. The sons of God, to use the Genesis terminology, looked upon the daughters of men and found them beautiful and took them as wives. And from these unions came offspring described as Nephilim, as heroes of old, men of renown, as Gibborim, mighty ones. The Sumerian and Akkadian texts contain parallel accounts, gods and goddesses mating with humans, producing hybrid offspring, demigods who walked the earth with powers beyond ordinary human capacity. Gilgamesh himself, the great hero king of Uruk, whose epic survives as one of humanity's oldest stories, was described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, born of the goddess Ninsun and a human father. What were these hybrid beings? The texts suggest they were extraordinary, possessing gifts from both lineages, the physical form of humanity combined with something of divine capability. They were leaders, warriors, rulers, builders of cities and founders of dynasties. They were also, perhaps, exactly what the gods feared, evidence that the boundaries between creator and creation were blurring, that humanity was not remaining in its designated place, that the hierarchy upon which the entire system depended was breaking down. Think about this from the perspective of Enlil, the stern commander, the one who insisted on order and control and proper subordination. He had never been comfortable with Enki's creation of humanity. He had wanted the problem of divine labor solved through different means. And now that creation was not merely multiplying beyond control, not merely making noise that disturbed his rest, but actually merging with divinity itself, producing beings that carried divine essence in human form, beings that might eventually, given enough generations, given enough interbreeding, become indistinguishable from the gods themselves. The flood begins to look different in this light. Not punishment for generic wickedness, not divine irritation at human noise, but a desperate attempt to eliminate the hybrid experiment before it went further, to purge the genetic contamination, to reset the creation to its original parameters. The Genesis text is explicit that the flood's stated purpose was connected to the interbreeding problem. God saw that the wickedness of man was great. Yes, but this declaration comes immediately after the passage describing the unions between divine beings and human women, immediately after the reference to the Nephilim. The wickedness was the mixing. The corruption was the hybridization. The solution was the elimination of the contaminated lineage. But it did not work. Noah and his family survived, and the texts hint that the hybrid lineage survived with them or regenerated after. The Nephilim appear again in later biblical texts, giants in Canaan that the Israelites encountered, mighty beings that had to be defeated. Whatever the flood was meant to eliminate, it failed to eliminate completely. Something carried through. And if the Anunnaki understood this, if they recognized that their attempts to control or eliminate the hybrid problem had failed, if they saw that each generation of humanity carried more divine potential than the last, that the boundaries they had tried to maintain were permanently breached, they might well have experienced something very like fear. Not fear of immediate physical threat. The gods were still more powerful than any human or hybrid. But fear of trajectory, fear of where this was heading, fear that what they had created was becoming something that would eventually eclipse them. There is a moment in Greek mythology that captures this dynamic perfectly. Zeus and the Olympian gods, having defeated the Titans and established their reign, receive a prophecy that Zeus will be overthrown by a son greater than himself. This prophecy haunts the king of gods, shapes his behavior, leads him to swallow the goddess Metis when she becomes pregnant, to imprison or bind any being that might fulfill the threat. The gods live in fear of being surpassed, of the cycle of divine succession continuing, of creation overtaking creator. The Sumerian texts contain echoes of similar anxiety. Enlil's constant attempts to limit or destroy humanity, his opposition to Enki's protective interventions, his insistence that the creation was getting out of control, all of this reads as fear of what humanity might become. And if that fear reached a tipping point, if the gods looked at the trajectory of human development and saw that their window of unquestioned supremacy was closing, leaving might have seemed the only remaining option. Not defeated, not overthrown, but withdrawing before the balance shifted, retreating to wherever they came from while they still could, abandoning the experiment before the experiment abandoned them. Let that possibility settle into you like sediment drifting to the floor of an ancient sea. You do not need to accept it as truth, merely to feel its weight, its uncomfortable implications, its suggestion that we might be not the failed version of humanity, but the version that succeeded too well, the creation that frightened its creators into retreat. Breathe slowly now. Let your shoulders release whatever tension they are holding. We are drifting between theories like boats moving between islands, each one a possible landfall, none of them necessarily our final destination. The second theory moves the lens from Earth to sky, from what was happening on this planet to what might have been approaching from beyond it. What if the Anunnaki did not leave because of anything humanity did or became, but because they knew something was coming, something catastrophic, something that made Earth a dangerous place to be? We explored earlier the Younger Dryas event, that mysterious period approximately 12,800 years ago when the Earth experienced sudden dramatic climate change. Temperatures plunged. Ice sheets that had been retreating suddenly advanced again. Megafauna that had survived multiple ice age cycles abruptly went extinct. Human populations crashed, leaving genetic bottlenecks that modern DNA analysis can still detect. The standard explanation involves meltwater pulses and disrupted ocean circulation. But as we discussed, there is mounting evidence for something else, something from beyond Earth. Impact proxies appear in geological layers dating to exactly this period. Platinum anomalies, nanodiamonds, shocked quartz, melt glass spherules, all the signatures of cosmic collision appear simultaneously across multiple continents. Not a single massive impact like the dinosaur killer, but perhaps something more distributed, an airburst event or multiple impacts from a fragmenting comet or asteroid. The scale would have been apocalyptic for any civilization existing at that time. And here is what becomes interesting when we connect this geological evidence to the ancient texts. The flood narratives describe not merely rising water, but cosmic disruption. The fountains of the deep broke open, the windows of heaven were opened, fire and water both falling from the sky. The Babylonian versions describe the gods themselves fleeing to the highest heaven, cowering there in fear, weeping at the destruction they witnessed below. These are not the behaviors of gods who calmly initiated a punishment. These are the behaviors of beings who were themselves terrified of what was happening. The Kolbrin Bible, a controversial text whose provenance is disputed, but whose contents are fascinating regardless of origin, describes a celestial body called the Destroyer that periodically approaches Earth, bringing catastrophic effects with each passage. Fire sweeps the land, the seas rise and fall violently, civilizations are obliterated. The text explicitly links this to the Great Flood, describing the Destroyer's approach as the trigger for the deluge. Whether the Kolbrin preserves genuine ancient tradition or represents later synthesis, the concept it describes, a periodic cosmic threat that devastates Earth at regular intervals, appears across multiple ancient cultures. The Hindu texts describe the destruction and recreation of the world in cycles measured in millions of years. The Mayan calendars track vast periods culminating in transformative events. The Hopi speak of multiple worlds destroyed and reborn. If the Anunnaki possessed advanced astronomical knowledge, and the precision of their astronomical tablets suggests they did, they might have been able to predict cosmic events that humanity could not. they might have seen the approach of whatever caused the Younger Dryas catastrophe. They might have known that Earth was about to become very dangerous for any being, a divine or otherwise, who remained on its surface. The flood, in this reading, was not punishment but symptom. The gods did not send the waters, the gods fled the waters, retreating to their celestial abodes before the catastrophe struck. The warning to Utnapishtim, or Atrahasis, or Ziusudra was not divine mercy contradicting divine judgment, but simply one faction of the gods, Enki's faction, wanting to preserve their creation through the coming disaster, even as the majority were focused on their own evacuation. This would explain why the departure seems hurried rather than orderly. Cosmic events do not wait for convenient scheduling. If something was approaching, the window for safe departure might have been narrow. Leave now, or be caught in the destruction. The texts describe the gods gathering their possessions, gathering their families, ascending to their celestial habitats just before the catastrophe struck. The timing suggests urgency. The behavior suggests fear. And after the catastrophe passed, after the waters receded and the earth stabilized, the gods who survived discovered that their earthly infrastructure was destroyed. The cities they had built, the temples they had inhabited, the mining operations they had established, all of it swept away or buried under sediment. Perhaps return seemed pointless. Perhaps they had other priorities now. Perhaps whatever cosmic event had struck Earth was part of a larger pattern affecting their homeworld or their transit routes as well. Perhaps Earth simply became too dangerous, too unstable, too marked by catastrophe to justify continued investment. The departure was not rejection of humanity, but survival response, and the promise of return was genuine, but conditional on conditions becoming favorable again. Your breathing has slowed. Your body has grown heavy against whatever surface supports you. Let these images of cosmic catastrophe drift through your awareness without urgency, without alarm. These events, if they happened, happened long ago. You are safe in this moment. The stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, and whatever approaches from the depths of space approaches too slowly for us to perceive in a single human lifetime. The third possibility is perhaps the simplest, though it carries its own troubling implications. What if the Anunnaki were not fleeing at all? What if they were recalled? The texts are clear that the Anunnaki were not the highest tier of divine hierarchy. Above them stood Anu, the Sky Father, the supreme deity who remained in the celestial realm while his children worked on Earth. The Anunnaki were the workers, the administrators, the colonial officers of a cosmic empire that extended far beyond this single planet. Earth was an outpost, not a homeland. The assignment here, whatever it was temporary by design. Colonial officers get rotated, distant assignments end, workers complete their contracts and return home. What if the departure was simply the end of a very long shift? The work completed, or completed enough. The resources extracted, the experiment concluded. The orders from headquarters finally arriving after millennia of silence. Pack up, come home. The project here is finished. This reading has a certain elegance. It does not require catastrophe or fear or failure. It requires only bureaucracy, cosmic bureaucracy operating on timescales so vast that a few thousand years of earthly civilization fit within a single administrative period. The gods came, they did their work, they left when the work was done or when new orders arrived. Simple. But something still does not quite fit. The haste. The texts describe the departure as hurried, not orderly. The lament for and other city laments describe chaos, confusion, gods abandoning their temples suddenly, protective presences withdrawing without warning. If this were routine rotation, scheduled departure, orderly transition, we would expect different textual evidence. We would expect farewell rituals, handover ceremonies, preparations of successors. We get none of that. We get silence that falls suddenly. We get temples that empty overnight. We get a generation of priests bewildered by the absence of their gods, maintaining rituals for entities that no longer respond, waiting for return that never comes. Perhaps the recall was sudden because of events in the celestial realm that the earthly texts do not record. Perhaps there was conflict among the Anunnaki themselves, faction turning against faction, some being summoned or banished, while others chose different paths. The texts do contain hints of divine conflict, of rivalries between Enlil and Enki, between different cities' patron deities, of cosmic wars in heaven that parallel the wars on earth. Perhaps what we interpret as panicked departure was actually violent extraction, some gods being forced to leave by other gods. The losing faction in a celestial civil war being recalled or expelled, while the victors remained or also departed for their own reasons. We cannot know. The texts preserve fragments, not complete archives. But the possibility that the departure was ordered rather than chosen, compelled rather than voluntary, adds another layer to the mystery. The Anunnaki might not have wanted to leave. They might have had no choice. And the promise of return might have been not reassurance, but hope. The hope of exiles that someday they might be permitted to come back to the place they had worked and lived and created for so long. Let that possibility float alongside the others. 3 theories now swirling in the darkness behind your eyes. 3 explanations for the same mysterious event. None of them proven, none of them disprovable, each illuminating different aspects of the textual evidence. And now the 4th theory, perhaps the most radical, the one that reverses the power dynamic entirely. What if the Anunnaki lost control? What if they did not leave by choice or by order or by fear of cosmic catastrophe, but because they were no longer able to remain? The Igigi rebellion, which we touched on earlier, provides a template for divine worker uprising. The junior gods, forced to labor in the mining operations, reached a breaking point and refused to work further. This rebellion was resolved through the creation of humanity, a new labor force to replace the rebellious one. But what if a second rebellion occurred? This one not among gods, but among humans, and this one not so easily resolved. The Tower of Babel narrative in Genesis describes exactly such an uprising. Humanity, speaking one language and working in coordinated unity, undertakes a massive construction project, a tower reaching to heaven, a structure that would bring humans into the celestial realm. The divine response is immediate and fearful. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. The goal is explicit: to prevent human coordination, to break the unity that made such ambitious projects possible. And the stated reason is remarkable. If, as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. The gods are afraid. Not annoyed, not offended, afraid. They recognize that unified humanity possesses potential they cannot contain. The only solution is to shatter that unity, to scatter humanity across the earth, to ensure they can never again coordinate on such a scale. This reads as fear of being overthrown. Fear that humanity, if permitted to organize and cooperate fully, would eventually reach heaven, not metaphorically, but literally, would challenge divine supremacy, would demand equality with their creators, or simply take it. The confusion of languages is not punishment, but population control, not consequence, but desperate intervention to prevent an outcome the gods cannot otherwise prevent. Now extend this dynamic. What if the scattering was not enough? What if some humans retained their capabilities, their organization, their ambition? What if the hybrid beings, the Nephilim, with their divine heritage and their human numbers, began to challenge the gods directly? What if the mines were occupied, the temples besieged, the gods themselves threatened by their own creation? We have no text that describes this scenario directly, but we have hints. We have references to wars between gods and giants, to battles in heaven, to divine powers deployed against earthly challenges. We have myths from many cultures describing periods when gods and heroes fought, when the boundaries between mortal and immortal blurred, when the outcome of such conflicts was not certain. If the Anunnaki found themselves facing a genuine threat from below, an uprising they could not suppress through plague or flood or confusion, they might have chosen strategic withdrawal, retreat to celestial strongholds, wait out the crisis, let time do what force could not, let human mortality slowly remove the challenges while the immortal gods remained safe above. The short human lifespan in this reading becomes not just population control, but insurance. Even if humans prevailed in a generation, their leaders would die. Their unity would fragment as languages diverged and cultures separated. Given enough time, enough generations, enough natural attrition, the threat would fade. And then, perhaps, the gods could return to find a humanity suitably diminished, suitably scattered, suitably humbled, ready once again to serve. The promise of return carries different weight in this theory. Not the promise of loving gods returning to their children, but the promise of colonial powers returning to a territory temporarily lost, waiting for the right moment to reassert control. 4 theories now. 4 possible explanations for the departure. The experiment failed, and the creators fled before their creation surpassed them. A something cosmic approached, and the gods evacuated before catastrophe struck. Higher authority recalled them for reasons we cannot know, or humanity rose against them and they retreated rather than risked defeat. Perhaps one of these is true. Perhaps all of them contain elements of truth. Perhaps the actual cause was something we have not considered, something the texts do not preserve, something lost in the millennia between the events and the writing. What remains is the departure itself, the undeniable textual evidence that divine presence withdrew, the archaeological evidence of temples maintained for absent gods, the global mythology of beings who left but promised to return, the silence that fell over the ancient world and has never fully lifted. Let your breathing deepen now. Let your body sink into whatever surface supports it. These theories do not require resolution tonight. They are threads to follow into sleep, into dream, into the places where the conscious mind releases its grip and other forms of knowing become possible. Perhaps in the liminal space between waking and sleeping, some other understanding will emerge, some synthesis of all these possibilities, some insight that daylight thinking cannot quite reach. The Anunnaki departed. That much seems clear. Why they left, whether in panic or peace, in fear or duty, in retreat or rotation, remains uncertain. And in that uncertainty, there is a strange kind of comfort. We do not have all the answers. We are not meant to have all the answers. The mystery itself is part of the inheritance, the questions as important as any conclusions. Feel your eyes growing heavy if they are not already closed. Feel the weight of millennia pressing gently against your awareness, not crushing, but cradling, holding you in the same darkness that held the scribes who pressed their styluses into wet clay, trying to preserve what they knew, what they feared, what they hoped their descendants would understand. You are their descendant. You are reading their words across 4,000 years of silence. And somewhere in that vast span of time, the answer waits, patient as stone, old as stars, ready to be found by whoever is willing to keep looking. Let your breathing slow now as we move deeper into the physical evidence, into the stones and clay and empty chambers that still hold the memory of departure. Because what archaeologists have uncovered across Mesopotamia tells a story that textbooks rarely emphasize. A story not of gradual decline, but of deliberate closure, of temples sealed rather than abandoned, of sacred objects carefully removed rather than left behind or looted. And this distinction matters enormously when we try to understand what happened to the beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. Picture yourself descending into the excavation at Eridu, that ancient city we visited at the beginning of our journey, where 17 temples were built one atop another over millennia, each generation rebuilding on the exact footprint of the one before, as if following instructions that could not be altered. When archaeologists from the Iraqi Department of Antiquities and the British School of Archaeology excavated the lowest levels in the 1940s, and again in subsequent decades, they found something peculiar in the final temple phases. Not destruction, not the burned timbers and scattered artifacts that mark conquest or catastrophe, but orderly emptiness. The innermost sanctuaries, the Holy of Holies where the divine presence was believed to dwell, had been carefully cleared. Offering tables remained in place, but the objects that would have rested upon them were gone. Pedestals that once held divine statues stood empty, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of anointing oils that priests had applied to statues that no longer exist. The pattern repeats at Nippur, the great religious center of Sumer, seat of Enlil himself, that stern sky god who commanded the divine council. The Ikur temple, his earthly dwelling, shows the same signature of deliberate emptying rather than violent destruction. German and American expeditions excavating through the late 19th and 20th centuries documented this carefully, though they interpreted it through the lens of conventional history as evidence of ritual practice or political transition. But the temple inventories, those meticulous clay tablets that Mesopotamian priests kept with bureaucratic precision, tell a different story. These inventories list items that were taken to heaven, objects described as ascending with their divine owners, not transferred to other temples or melted down for their precious metals, but removed from the earthly plane entirely. The phrase itself appears in multiple texts, taken to heaven, as if the scribes were documenting an evacuation rather than a robbery or a relocation. At Uruk, the great city of Gilgamesh, the pattern grows even more complex. The Iana precinct, dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, shows evidence of both orderly departure and hasty abandonment in different phases. Some chambers were cleared methodically, floors swept, doors ritually sealed with clay impressed with sacred symbols. Other areas show signs of hurried evacuation, objects dropped in corridors, storerooms left partially emptied as if the removal was interrupted. This dual pattern, calm departure alongside panicked flight, appears at multiple sites, suggesting that whatever prompted the leaving did not affect all beings equally or simultaneously. Some had time to prepare, others did not. The mystery of the missing divine statues has puzzled archaeologists for generations. Mesopotamian temples were centered around the cult statue, a physical representation of the deity that was not merely a symbol, but was believed to be literally inhabited by divine presence. These statues received daily meals, were dressed in fine garments, were put to bed at night and awakened in the morning. They were the most valuable and most sacred objects in any temple complex. Yet, despite the wealth of artifacts recovered from Mesopotamian sites, despite the thousands of clay tablets and cylinder seals and pottery vessels and jewelry and tools, remarkably few primary cult statues have ever been found. The standard explanation is that they were made of precious materials and were therefore looted or melted down by later conquerors. This is certainly possible, but the temple inventories suggest another explanation, that the statues, like the divine presence they embodied, simply left, went to heaven, departed with their owners. When we compare Mesopotamian temple abandonment patterns with those of other ancient civilizations, the differences are instructive. Egyptian temples, when abandoned, typically show either gradual deterioration as communities shrank and maintenance ceased, or violent destruction by foreign conquerors, or purposeful dismantling by later pharaohs who reused the stone for their own monuments. Greek and Roman temples show similar patterns of decline, destruction, or conversion to other uses. What they rarely show is the careful closure, the ritualized emptying, the sealing of doors that we find in Mesopotamia. The temples were not being abandoned in the usual sense. They were being closed down, like a business that relocates, taking its essential equipment and personnel while leaving the building intact. The priests who maintained these empty temples for generations afterward, performing rituals for absent gods, lighting incense before empty pedestals, reciting prayers into silence. What did they know that we do not? What were they told about the departure? What promise sustained them through decades and centuries of waiting? These questions have no definitive answers in the archaeological record, but the record itself speaks of something unusual, something that distinguishes the end of divine presence in Mesopotamia from the simple decline of religious practice that we see elsewhere. The gods did not fade away. They left, and someone thought it important to document that leaving with bureaucratic precision. But now let your awareness drift to a different kind of evidence, to texts and monuments that seem designed not merely to record the past, but to warn the future, to encode knowledge that would survive the departure and await rediscovery by generations yet to come. The concept of sealing knowledge, of burying important information until the proper time for its revelation, appears across ancient cultures in ways that suggest deliberate intention rather than accidental preservation. Consider Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, that massive temple complex built around 9600 BCE by people we believed were simple hunter-gatherers. The site itself challenges our assumptions about the development of civilization, its carved pillars and sophisticated astronomical alignments predating the supposed invention of agriculture by millennia. But equally significant is what happened to it. Around 8000 BCE, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Not abandoned, not destroyed, but carefully covered with thousands of tons of earth and debris, preserving it with remarkable precision for the next 10,000 years. Why would people who had invested generations of effort in building such a site deliberately bury it? The standard archaeological interpretation suggests ritual closure, the ending of the site's active use through ceremonial interment. But another interpretation is possible. Perhaps they were preserving it, hiding it, protecting it from something that was coming, or ensuring its survival for someone who would come later. The vulture stone at Göbekli Tepe, Pillar 43, bears carvings that some researchers interpret as an astronomical record, a star map depicting specific constellations as they would have appeared in the sky nearly 13,000 years ago. The configuration has been linked to the date of the Younger Dryas impact event, that catastrophic moment around 10,800 BCE when cometary fragments may have struck the Earth, triggering wildfires across continents and a 1,000-year climate catastrophe. If this interpretation is correct, and it remains debated among scholars, then the vulture stone is not merely decorative art, but a warning carved in stone, a message to future generations that this happened, that fire came from the sky, that the world can end and begin again. The deliberate burial of the site would then make sense as an act of preservation, ensuring that this warning would survive whatever was coming, and it would wait in the earth until someone was ready to receive it. Babylonian omen texts, those endless catalogues of signs and portents that priests compiled over centuries, contain passages of unusual urgency that stand out from the general tone of methodical observation. Most omen literature reads like scientific notation, clinical and detached. If the moon is surrounded by a halo and Jupiter stands within it, the king of Akkad will be besieged. But scattered among these routine predictions are warnings of a different character. Prophecies of celestial visitors that bring destruction, of gods departing and returning, of cycles that repeat across spans of time that dwarf human history. The Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive compendium of celestial omens compiled over centuries, but containing material far older than its final form, includes passages about wandering stars that do not behave like the planets the Babylonians knew so well, objects that appear suddenly in the heavens and portend massive change. Were the priests recording astronomical observations that we have yet to rediscover? Were they preserving knowledge of cyclical catastrophes, of regular visitors from deeper space, of patterns that their predecessors had witnessed and encoded for future warning? The Mesopotamian concept of the Tablet of Destinies, that mythological object that contained the fates of gods and mortals alike, may reflect a real practice of encoding crucial knowledge in imperishable form. The myths describe how this tablet was stolen, fought over, passed from god to god, as if the information it contained was too important to ever be allowed to disappear. And perhaps the physical tablets that archaeologists have recovered, those clay documents describing creation and catastrophe and divine departure, are themselves attempts to create tablets of destiny, to encode what mattered most in forms that would survive the coming absence. If the Anunnaki knew they were leaving, and if they wished to preserve some thread of connection with the humanity they had created or modified or uplifted, what form would that preservation take? They could not leave their technology. It would be misunderstood or misused, or simply decay beyond recognition. They could not leave living representatives. Such beings would be worshipped as gods themselves, creating exactly the dependence the departure was perhaps meant to end. But they could leave stories. They could leave structures aligned to cosmic constants that any future civilization would recognize. They could leave mathematical relationships encoded in monuments. They could leave warnings disguised as mythology, instructions dressed as ritual, star maps carved in stone and buried under artificial hills to await the proper moment of discovery. Is that what we are finding now? As we excavate these ancient sites with technologies the ancients could not have imagined, as we photograph temples from satellites and analyze pottery with mass spectrometers and sequence DNA from ancient bones, are we finally becoming capable of reading messages that waited for us through millennia of silence? The possibility is tantalizing without being provable. But the evidence of deliberate preservation, of knowledge buried and sealed and encoded, cannot be entirely explained away as coincidence or our own pattern-seeking imagination. Someone went to enormous effort to ensure that certain things would survive, and we are only beginning to understand what those things might be. Let your breathing find its slowest rhythm now, as we approach perhaps the most poignant aspect of the departure evidence, the promises that were made, the expectation of return that haunted every civilization that remembered the departed gods. The texts do not merely describe gods leaving, they describe gods promising to come back. And this promise, whether literal or metaphorical, whether fulfilled or eternally deferred, has shaped human religious consciousness ever since, creating what might be the most enduring legacy of the Anunnaki departure, an endless waiting that continues to this day. The Mesopotamian texts speak of cycles, of returns, of times when the gods will once again walk among mortals. The Epic of Era describes a future restoration after devastation, a time when abandoned temples will again be inhabited, when the silence will be broken by divine voices. Scattered prophecies promise the return of specific deities, their reappearance linked to celestial configurations, to the completion of great cycles, to moments of cosmic alignment. The controversial researcher Zecharia Sitchin proposed that these cycles were tied to the orbit of Nibiru, the supposed home planet of the Anunnaki, which he calculated at approximately 3,600 years, based on his interpretation of Sumerian astronomical texts. Mainstream scholars reject this interpretation, noting that the term Nibiru in Babylonian astronomy refers to Jupiter, or possibly to a point of celestial transition rather than to an undiscovered planet. But the concept of cyclical return, whether tied to Nibiru or to other cosmic patterns, appears in the original texts themselves, independent of any modern interpretation. The gods who left would return. The cycle would complete. The silence was not permanent, but was a pause, an intermission, a period of testing or waiting or transformation. This expectation of divine return appears across cultures that have no obvious historical connection to Mesopotamia, suggesting either remarkably widespread cultural diffusion or independent responses to the same underlying reality. The Aztec and Maya awaited the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. Now the culture bringer who had departed across the eastern sea, promising to come back. When Cortes arrived in 1519, the timing seemed to match certain calendrical expectations, and the confusion between conquistador and returning god may have contributed to the conquest. The Inca anticipated Viracocha, who had walked among them in ancient times, teaching civilization before disappearing across the Pacific with a promise to return when needed. The Hindu tradition awaits Kalki, the final avatar of Vishnu, who will appear at the end of Kali Yuga to restore righteousness and begin a new golden age. Buddhism anticipates Maitreya, the future Buddha, who will appear when the teachings have been forgotten and humanity needs guidance once again. And of course, the Christian tradition centers on the second coming of Christ, the promised return of the divine made flesh, which has been anticipated by every generation since the 1st century without yet occurring. What does it mean that every major religious tradition, regardless of its other beliefs and practices, includes an expectation of divine return? Is this merely a psychological need, a universal human longing for rescue, for redemption, for the simplicity of divine guidance in an impossibly complex world? Or does it reflect actual promises made in actual encounters, promises encoded in the founding stories of each tradition, promises that diverge in their details but converge in their essential message? We will return. Wait for us. Remember. The calculation of when such a return might occur has occupied scholars and mystics for millennia without producing consensus. If we follow Sitchin's 3,600-year cycle and attempt to calculate forward from various proposed starting points, we arrive at dates ranging from the recent past to centuries in the future, depending on which baseline event we choose. If we follow the Hindu calculations of the Yugas, we find ourselves in Kali Yuga, with approximately 427,000 years remaining before the next golden age begins. If we follow Christian eschatology, the return is imminent but unknowable in its timing, a state of perpetual anticipation that has now lasted 2,000 years. Perhaps the timing was never meant to be precisely calculated. Perhaps the promise of return served a different function entirely, not as a specific prediction, but as a form of connection, a thread maintained across the vast silence of divine absence. By waiting for the gods to return, humanity preserved the memory of the gods having been present. The waiting itself became the worship. The expectation became the prayer. And in maintaining that expectation generation after generation, the essential knowledge was transmitted. There were beings before. They created or taught or modified us. They departed. They promised to return. Whether they ever do return, whether the promise was literal or metaphorical, whether the return has already happened in some form we did not recognize or awaits us still in the unwritten future. The promise itself has shaped human consciousness in ways that extend far beyond religious belief. Our space programs search for extraterrestrial intelligence with instruments pointed at distant stars. And some researchers have speculated that what we are looking for out there is in some sense what we once had here. Contact with intelligence greater than our own. Confirmation that we are not alone. Reunion with something we lost so long ago that we no longer remember it as memory, but experience it only as longing. The empty temples still stand, restored now by archaeologists and visited by tourists who walk where priests once waited in vain for divine footsteps. The tablets still preserve their prophecies, their promises, their precise accounts of gods who departed and will one day return. And we who read these texts in the soft glow of museum lighting or the blue glare of computer screens, we who translate cuneiform and debate the meaning of symbols pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, we are perhaps still waiting too. Waiting without knowing, we are waiting. Hoping without knowing what we hope for. Watching the skies with instruments the ancients could not have dreamed of, yet driven by the same ancient impulse, surely they did not simply leave forever. Surely they will come back. Surely the silence will one day break, and the temples will be inhabited once more. And the questions that haunt us through sleepless nights will finally find their answers. Let these questions rest now without requiring answers. Let the evidence settle like dust in an empty sanctuary. The temples were closed but not destroyed. The warnings were encoded and buried and preserved. The promises were made and recorded and passed down through 100 generations. And we, the inheritors of all this waiting, we drift towards sleep, carrying these mysteries with us into the country of dreams, where perhaps the ancient gods still walk, where perhaps the return has already happened in that other realm beyond waking, where perhaps the answers await those who remember how to ask the questions that the Sumerians pressed into wet clay before the silence fell and the waiting began. The silence must have been deafening at first, that strange new quiet that settled over the temple complexes in the centuries after the departure, a silence so profound that the priests who remained must have felt it as a physical weight pressing against their chests as they performed the ancient rituals in empty sanctuaries, lighting incense for gods who no longer appeared, and they're offering food and drink to statues that had once housed living divine presence, but now stood hollow and cold, their eyes of lapis lazuli and gold staring at nothing, reflecting nothing, receiving nothing. Imagine yourself as one of these priests in the generations immediately following the departure, perhaps in Eridu or Nippur or Ur, waking before dawn as your father did, and his father before him, performing the opening of the mouth ceremony for the divine statue, chanting the hymns of greeting, preparing the sacred meals, waiting for some sign, some whisper, some flicker of the melamu, that divine radiance that once filled these halls with light that was not quite light, with presence that was not quite physical but was undeniably real. And nothing comes. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade, you perform the rituals exactly as they were taught to you, exactly as they were performed when the gods still answered. Because perhaps the silence is a test. Perhaps the gods are watching from their celestial abodes to see if their servants remain faithful. Perhaps if you perform the rituals perfectly enough, completely enough, devotedly enough, they will return. The Mesopotamian lament literature preserves this anguish with devastating clarity. Poems that scholars have translated and catalogued and filed away as religious literature, but which read, when you approach them with fresh eyes, as the documentation of abandonment, as the raw grief of a people whose entire cosmological framework had suddenly gone dark. The Lament for Ur, composed after the fall of that great city around 2000 BCE, contains passages that speak not merely of military defeat, but of divine withdrawal, of the goddess Ningal weeping for her city, of the gods departing one by one, abandoning their sanctuaries, letting the sacred places fall to ruin. How long does one wait before accepting that what has left is not coming back? The archaeological record suggests the answer is centuries, perhaps longer, because the temple complexes continued to be maintained long after any reasonable expectation of divine return. The rituals continued to be performed, the offerings continued to be made, the sacred fires continued to be lit in the darkness before dawn by priests who had never known the presence their grandfathers described, who performed ceremonies whose original purpose they no longer fully understood, but which they continued because stopping felt like a betrayal, because the accumulated weight of tradition had become its own justification. This is the psychology of abandoned worship, a phenomenon we see throughout human history whenever a central organizing principle suddenly vanishes, and it produces a peculiar kind of religious practice, one that becomes increasingly focused on form rather than content, on correct performance rather than genuine contact, on preserving the structures even when the presence that once animated them has departed. The mystery religions that emerged across the ancient Mediterranean world in the centuries following the departure may represent one response to this silence. Secret traditions that claimed to preserve the true knowledge the public temples had lost. Initiation rites that promised contact with divine forces that the mainstream priesthoods could no longer deliver. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, the cult of Isis in Egypt, the Mithraic traditions that spread through the Roman military, each of these claimed access to hidden wisdom, to secret teachings, to direct experience of the divine that the official religions could no longer provide. Were these genuine preservations of pre-departure knowledge passed down through carefully guarded lineages, or were they later inventions attempting to fill the void the departed gods had left behind? The answer is probably both. Threads of authentic ancient teaching woven together with later elaboration and innovation, in truth and invention so thoroughly mixed that separating them became impossible even for the initiates themselves. Let your breathing slow now as we move from the anguish of abandonment to something more consoling. The remarkable human capacity to preserve even what we no longer fully understand, to maintain traditions across millennia, to pass forward fragments of knowledge in the hope that future generations might reassemble what we have lost. The scribes of ancient Mesopotamia understood this duty with a clarity that still moves those who study their work today, because they copied and recopied texts for over 2,000 years, maintaining the cuneiform tradition from its origins in the 4th millennium BCE through the fall of Babylon and beyond, preserving documents whose language had become archaic, whose references had become obscure, whose purpose had become uncertain, simply because the texts were ancient, because they had been passed down, because somewhere in their wedge-shaped impressions might lie knowledge too important to lose. King Ashurbanipal of Assyria, ruling in the 7th century BCE, assembled in his palace at Nineveh what may have been the ancient world's greatest library, over 30,000 clay tablets covering every subject the Mesopotamian intellectual tradition had developed. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, magic, mythology, royal correspondence, legal codes, epic poetry. His motivation, preserved in his own inscriptions, was explicitly preservational. He wrote that he gathered these texts so that he might read the beautiful clay tablets whose contents were obscure Sumerian or Akkadian, difficult to interpret, and committed to memory the secrets of the art of writing. Here was a king, a military conqueror who had crushed rebellions with legendary brutality, spending his evenings studying ancient languages so that wisdom might not be lost. When Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, sacked by a coalition of Babylonians and Medes, the library burned. But the fire that destroyed the palace also baked the clay tablets into ceramic permanence, preserving them for the archaeologists who would excavate the site 2,500 years later. The very catastrophe meant to destroy Assyrian culture forever became the mechanism of its preservation. And perhaps this was not entirely accidental. Perhaps the scribes who shaped their knowledge in clay rather than papyrus or parchment understood that clay survives what organic materials cannot. Perhaps they were thinking in millennia rather than decades, encoding their most important knowledge in the one medium that fire would preserve rather than destroy. The astronomical knowledge the Mesopotamians maintained is particularly striking because it demonstrates a level of precision that seems to exceed what their agricultural or calendrical needs required. They tracked the movements of planets across decades and centuries, recorded eclipses with a precision that allows modern astronomers to confirm their observations, developed mathematical models for predicting celestial events that would not be matched until the Renaissance. Why this obsessive attention to the heavens? The conventional explanation is religion. The gods were associated with celestial bodies. Tracking the planets was tracking the gods. But what if the original purpose was more practical? What if this astronomical tradition began as navigation, as tracking the comings and goings of beings who moved between earth and heaven, as maintaining the knowledge necessary to understand when those beings might return? The mathematical and engineering principles encoded in ancient monuments represent another form of preservation, one that does not depend on language or literacy, one that could survive even if every text were destroyed and every spoken tradition forgotten. The Great Pyramid of Giza, whatever its original purpose, encodes mathematical relationships that any sufficiently advanced future civilization could recognize and decode. The relationship between circumference and diameter that we call pi, proportions that approximate the golden ratio, dimensions that relate to the size of the Earth itself. Whether these encodings were intentional or emergent from the geometric constraints of pyramid construction remains debated, but the effect is the same. Mathematical knowledge preserved in stone that will outlast any document, any library, any language. And now we come to what was lost, the knowledge that did not survive, the teachings that faded, the technologies that disappeared, the connections that withered in the long silence after the departure. Let your body grow heavy as we contemplate these losses, not with despair, but with the particular melancholy that accompanies any contemplation of what might have been, what was known and then forgotten, what our ancestors possessed, and we do not. The Sumerian king list, that strange document we explored earlier with its impossible reign lengths before the flood and its gradually diminishing spans after, might be read as a record of exactly this kind of loss. A chronicle of declining human capacity tracked through the most fundamental measure available: how long we live. The earliest post-flood kings still reigned for centuries, then for decades, then finally for spans that match normal human lifespans. If we read this literally, it describes a species losing something generation by generation. with some capacity or knowledge or connection that once allowed for extraordinary longevity, slowly draining away like water from a cracked vessel. Medical knowledge presents another form of documented decline, because the surgical procedures described in ancient Mesopotamian texts and the Egyptian medical papyri include practices that seem remarkably advanced for their era, including cranial surgery, complex pharmacology, and understanding of anatomy that would not be matched in Europe until the Renaissance or later. The standard explanation is that this knowledge was never lost, merely developed independently at different times in different cultures. But there is another possibility, that certain medical traditions represented genuine preservation of pre-departure teaching that gradually degraded as each generation preserved a little less than it received, as the original understanding faded into rote practice, as the why behind the procedures was forgotten, even while the procedures themselves continued. Certain ancient technologies seem to have simply vanished without explanation, leaving behind products we can analyze, but processes we cannot fully replicate. The Damascus steel of medieval Islamic swordsmiths contained carbon nanostructures that modern metallurgists can identify but did not intentionally create until the development of nanotechnology, the formula lost when the trade routes supplying specific ore types were disrupted. Greek fire, the incendiary weapon that defended Constantinople for centuries, burned on water, could not be extinguished by conventional means, and its composition died with the Byzantine Empire, never successfully replicated despite centuries of attempts. Roman concrete, which allowed the Pantheon dome to stand for 2,000 years without the steel reinforcement modern concrete requires, contained chemical properties that modern engineers are only now beginning to understand and replicate. These might be independent inventions later lost to historical accident, or they might be fragments of older knowledge preserved imperfectly across the departure and its aftermath. Teachings that survived in practice long after the theory that produced them had been forgotten. The sense of cosmic connection itself may have been the greatest casualty of the departure, that direct awareness of humanity's place in a larger order, the lived experience of walking among beings who came from the stars and would return to them, the knowledge that the universe was inhabited, purposeful, aware. In the generations immediately following the departure, this knowledge was still fresh, still painful, still the subject of laments and prayers and desperate rituals. But as centuries passed and the gods did not return, as the direct experiences became stories, became legends, became myths, the cosmic connection faded into abstraction, into belief rather than knowledge, into faith rather than memory. We went from knowing to hoping to merely imagining, and something essential was lost in that transition. It was some grounding in larger reality that we have been trying to recover ever since, through religion, through philosophy, through science, through the very space programs that now send our own vessels toward the stars our ancestors said their gods came from. What else might we be missing? The cuneiform tablets we have translated represent perhaps 10% of what has been excavated, and what has been excavated represents perhaps 1% of what lies still buried beneath the sands of Iraq and Syria, beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf, beneath the agricultural fields that cover ancient city mounds that have never been systematically explored. Each year, tablets emerge that contain words we do not recognize, concepts we cannot pass, references to places and practices and beings we have never encountered in other texts. We are reading fragments of a library that once contained thousands of volumes, assembling a puzzle whose complete picture we may never see, translating languages whose full vocabulary we may never recover. And yet, enough survives to tell us that something remarkable happened in ancient Mesopotamia, that the people who lived there believed themselves to be the recipients of knowledge and guidance from beings who came from elsewhere, who stayed for a time, who departed for reasons the texts describe with varying degrees of clarity, and who may or may not return. The silence they left behind speaks as loudly as their presence once did, a silence that lasted for millennia, a silence that we are only now beginning to break as we decipher their tablets, excavate their cities, and wonder whether the stories they preserved might be something more than mythology, might be, in their own ancient way, history. Now let your awareness expand outward from Mesopotamia, outward from those clay tablets and empty temple platforms, outward across continents and oceans, to places where different peoples, speaking different languages, wearing different clothes, worshipping under different stars, all told remarkably similar stories about gods who left. Because the Anunnaki departure, if we can call it that, was not recorded only in Sumerian cuneiform. It echoes across the ancient world in traditions that supposedly had no contact with one another, in mythologies that developed independently on opposite sides of the planet, in sacred texts preserved by cultures separated by thousands of miles of ocean and thousands of years of isolated development. The pattern, once you begin to see it, becomes impossible to unsee. And the question it raises is both simple and profound. Why would everyone remember the same thing? Let us travel first to Egypt, to the land of the Nile, where the great god Ra once walked among humanity in the Golden Age, called Zep Tepi, the first time. The Egyptian texts preserved in the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and later the Book of the Dead, describe a period when the gods ruled directly on earth, when Ra himself sat upon the throne of the two lands and governed humanity face to face. But Ra grew old, the texts tell us, and humanity began to plot against him. They whispered in corners, they schemed in shadows, they forgot their reverence for the aging sun god. Ra, learning of this ingratitude, considered destroying humanity entirely. He sent his eye, the goddess Hathor, in her terrible aspect as Sekhmet, to slaughter the rebellious humans. But at the last moment, Ra relented. He flooded the fields with beer dyed red to look like blood, and Sekhmet, drinking it, became intoxicated and ceased her destruction. Humanity was spared, but Ra had had enough. He withdrew from Earth entirely, ascending to the heavens on the back of the celestial cow nut, rising higher and higher until he became the distant sun that crosses the sky each day, present but unreachable, visible but no longer among us. The other gods followed Ra into the celestial realm. Thoth was left behind to govern in Ra's absence, to maintain what order remained, but the age of direct divine rule was over. The gods had departed. Egypt was left to human pharaohs who could only claim divine descent, who could only embody the gods through ritual and symbol, who could only remember and reenact what was once living reality. The texts are explicit about this transition. There was a before when gods walked the earth. There was a departure when gods withdrew to heaven. There was an after when humanity was left to remember and to wait. Travel now eastward to India, to the vast corpus of Sanskrit literature that preserves an equally detailed memory of divine withdrawal. The Vedas and Puranas describe the Devas, the Shining Ones, who in earlier ages interacted directly with humanity, who taught the sacred knowledge, who fought great wars that shook the heavens and earth. The Mahabharata, that enormous epic containing over 100,000 verses, describes a time when gods walked among men, when divine weapons called astras could destroy entire armies, when flying vehicles called vimanas carried the gods across the sky. But the Devas withdrew. The Great War of Kurukshetra, described in such vivid detail that some researchers have wondered if it preserves memory of actual conflict, ended an age. Krishna, the divine avatar who had walked among humanity in physical form, departed the earth. The Bhagavata Purana describes his ascension, how he left his mortal coil and returned to his celestial abode, how the age of Dvapara Yuga ended and Kali Yuga began. The gods became distant. The direct interventions ceased. The spiritual connection that once allowed humans to perceive divine reality directly became attenuated, filtered, reduced to scripture and ritual, and the fading memory of what had once been immediate presence. The timing is suggestive. Traditional Hindu chronology places the beginning of Kali Yuga at 3102 BCE, remarkably close to the period when Sumerian civilization was crystallizing its own memories of divine presence and departure. Two traditions, two cultures, two continents, converging on the same approximate era for the transition from divine presence to divine absence. Now let us turn to Greece, where the pattern repeats with particular clarity. Greek mythology describes distinct ages of divine-human interaction, each one more distant than the last. In the Golden Age under Kronos, humans lived among the gods, free from toil and suffering, eating the fruits of the earth without labor, dying peacefully as if falling asleep. The Silver Age saw the first decline, humans becoming less virtuous, more troublesome. The Bronze Age brought violence and war. The Heroic Age, the time of Heracles and Theseus and the Trojan War, saw gods intervening constantly in human affairs, fathering children with mortal women, taking sides in conflicts, walking disguised among humanity. But then came the Iron Age, the present age according to Hesiod writing in the 8th century BCE, and the gods withdrew to distant Olympus. They no longer walked among humanity. They communicated through oracles, through dreams, through portents and signs, but not through direct presence. And even the oracles eventually fell silent. The temple at Delphi, where the Pythia had channeled Apollo's voice for centuries, eventually closed. The last recorded oracle, delivered to the Roman Emperor Julian in the 4th century CE, was a lament for divine departure. Tell the king that the fair-built court has fallen to the ground. No longer has Phoebus a hut, nor a prophetic laurel, nor a spring that speaks. The water of speech is quenched. The gods had left. The oracle had closed. The divine voice was silent. Even Mount Olympus, home of the gods for as long as Greeks could remember, had become merely a mountain. Its divine inhabitants departed to some realm beyond mortal reach. Travel further east to China, where the celestial emperors of the mythological period eventually returned to the stars from which they had descended. The 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, those legendary rulers of prehistoric China, were described as semi-divine beings who taught humanity the arts of civilization. And then, their work complete, ascended to heaven. The Yellow Emperor, Huangdi, after ruling for 100 years and bringing unprecedented prosperity and knowledge to his people, called together his ministers one final day. A dragon descended from the clouds to bear him away. 70 of his ministers and concubines clung to the dragon as it rose, but most lost their grip and fell back to earth. Only the Yellow Emperor ascended fully, returning to the celestial realm from which he had come. His ministers built the Chow Mountain tomb to commemorate his departure, though no body was buried there. How could there be a body when he had been taken bodily into heaven? The pattern holds across Asia. Divine teachers who brought civilization to humanity, who ruled directly for extended periods, who then withdrew, ascended, departed, leaving humanity to govern itself with only the memory and teachings of those vanished gods. Now let us make the most remarkable journey of all across the Pacific Ocean to the Americas, where cultures that could not possibly have had contact with Mesopotamia or Egypt or Greece or China preserved startlingly similar narratives. The Inca remembered Viracocha, the creator god who emerged from Lake Titicaca in the time before time. Viracocha was described as a tall figure, pale-skinned with a beard, who walked among the early peoples, teaching them agriculture, architecture, astronomy, the arts of civilization. He performed miracles, he shaped the landscape, he brought order from chaos, and then he departed. The chronicles recorded by Spanish missionaries preserve the Inca account of Viracocha's final journey. He walked across the water of the Pacific Ocean, heading west into the setting sun, promising to return one day. His last command to his people was to wait for his return, to remember his teachings, to maintain the order he had established. When the Spanish arrived in 1532, many among the Inca initially wondered if Viracocha was returning at last. The pale skin, the beards, the arrival from across the sea, it matched too closely with the ancient prophecies. This tragic misidentification facilitated the conquest, the Inca hesitating fatally when they should have resisted. But the story itself, the departure of a teaching god across the waters with a promise to return, predates any possible European contact. It was recorded in oral tradition long before Pizarro's arrival. Travel north to Mesoamerica, to the Aztec and their predecessor cultures who remembered Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. Like Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl was described as a civilizing god who brought knowledge and culture to humanity. Like Viracocha, he was often depicted as fair-skinned and bearded, unusual characteristics in Mesoamerican populations. And like Viracocha, he departed. The mythological Quetzalcoatl of the Aztec was conflated with a possibly historical figure, Tse-Acatl Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, a priest-king of Tula who lived around the 10th century CE. But the departure narrative is ancient, preceding this historical figure by millennia in some accounts. Quetzalcoatl sailed east across the Gulf of Mexico on a raft of serpents, promising to return. He specified the year of his return according to the Aztec calendar. And when Cortés arrived in 1519, in precisely that year, the effect was devastating. Montezuma, the Aztec emperor, was paralyzed by the possibility that the prophecy was being fulfilled. The departure story, the promise of return, became the mechanism of destruction when misapplied to Spanish conquistadors. But again, the story itself is not European contamination. It was old, deeply rooted, preserved across generations because it mattered, because it was true to the people who kept it alive. Further north, the Hopi of the American Southwest preserve traditions of the Kachina spirits who once lived among humanity, teaching, guiding, directly present in the villages. The Kachinas eventually departed to their homes in the San Francisco peaks and other sacred mountains. They no longer walk among the people as they once did. Now they are invoked through ceremony, through masked dancers who embody their presence temporarily, through ritual that remembers and reenacts what was once immediate reality. The Hopi ceremonies are not worship of absent gods, so much as attempts to maintain connection with beings who departed but did not die, who withdrew but did not abandon, who promised to return but have not yet done so. And so the pattern emerges, undeniable in its global scope. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki departed. In Egypt, Ra and the other Neteru withdrew to heaven. In India, the Devas retreated to higher realms. In Greece, the Olympians became distant and eventually silent. In China, the celestial emperors ascended to the stars. In Peru, Viracocha walked across the Pacific. In Mexico, Quetzalcoatl sailed east across the Gulf. In the American Southwest, the Kachinas withdrew to their mountain homes. Different names, different details, different cultural contexts, but the same essential story. Gods who once walked among us departed, promising to return. Now comes the question that haunts any serious examination of this pattern. When did this happen? Is there a convergence, a single era when the gods withdrew globally? Or are we seeing multiple departures at multiple times, each culture remembering its own unique event? The chronological challenge is immense because most of these traditions were oral for millennia before being written down. The Sumerian king list was inscribed around 2000 BCE, but claims to record events from before the flood, potentially thousands of years earlier. Egyptian Zep-Tepi, the first time when Ra ruled directly, is placed in a mythological past without precise dating. Hindu Kali Yuga begins in 3102 BCE, according to traditional calculation, but this date was computed long after the fact, using astronomical methods that some scholars question. Greek mythology provides no absolute dates for the transition from Golden Age to Iron Age. Nevertheless, certain convergences are suggestive. The period around 3000 BCE appears repeatedly as a threshold moment across multiple traditions. Sumerian civilization crystallizes in exactly this period, with its elaborate mythology of present gods beginning to show signs of departure. Egyptian dynastic history begins around 3100 BCE, placing the pre-dynastic age of direct divine rule in the centuries or millennia before. Hindu tradition places the Mahabharata war and Krishna's departure on the end of the age of direct divine interaction within centuries of this same threshold. But there are also echoes of earlier departures, much earlier. The Younger Dryas event around 12,800 years ago, that catastrophic climate shift we explored earlier, coincides with the boundary between Paleolithic hunter-gatherer existence and the tentative beginnings of Neolithic agricultural civilization. Some researchers have suggested that flood myths worldwide, including the Mesopotamian account of the Anunnaki fleeing to their celestial abodes during the deluge, preserve memory of this earlier catastrophe. If so, then the 3000 BCE threshold might represent not the departure itself, but the moment when oral traditions about a much earlier departure were first written down, crystallized into text from millennia of memory. The possibility of layered catastrophes producing layered memories of departure complicates any simple chronology. Perhaps the gods departed multiple times. Perhaps different groups of divine beings left at different eras. Perhaps each departure event traumatized the surviving humanity so deeply that the memory was preserved with extraordinary fidelity, passed down through hundreds of generations until finally committed to writing. The 2200 BCE event horizon, a documented period of climate disruption and civilizational collapse that affected Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other regions simultaneously, provides another candidate for divine departure, or at least the final departure, the last withdrawal of whatever divine presence had remained. The old kingdom of Egypt collapsed. The Akkadian Empire fell. The drought and famine swept across the ancient Near East. If any gods had remained as observers or advisors, this catastrophe might have prompted their final exit. But we cannot know with certainty. The evidence is fragmentary. The timelines are blurred by millennia of oral transmission before written recording. The cultural contexts are too diverse for simple correlation. What we can say is this: the pattern exists. It is global. It appears in traditions that had no known contact with one another, and it preserves a consistent narrative. There was a time when divine beings walked among us. They taught, they ruled, they shaped civilization, and then they left. They departed to the heavens, across the seas, to mountain sanctuaries, to realms beyond mortal reach. They promised to return, and we have been waiting ever since. Let this recognition settle into you now, not as certainty, but as wonder. Feel the weight of it, the humbling recognition that perhaps the most important event in human history, the departure of our creators or teachers or gods, left its mark on every culture that survived to remember. Feel your breathing slow. Feel your body growing heavy against the bed. Feel the boundary between waking and sleeping growing thin and permeable. The questions do not need answers tonight. They need only to be held, contemplated, allowed to sink into the deeper parts of consciousness where dreams might work on them in ways that waking thought cannot. Breathe slowly, breathe deeply, let your shoulders release whatever tension they are carrying. Let your jaw unclench. Let your eyes behind closed lids find rest. The pattern is there. I'd written in mythology across the globe, waiting for someone to recognize it, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Perhaps in sleep, in dream, in that liminal space between consciousness and the depths, some fragment of understanding will emerge. The gods departed. The stories agree. What made them leave, and whether they will return, these mysteries remain open, alive, worthy of the contemplation of all who wonder about our place in the cosmos and our relationship to whatever came before. But perhaps the most unsettling question isn't whether the Anunnaki left or why they departed in such apparent haste, but whether they ever truly left at all, whether some remained behind, hidden in places we cannot easily access, watching from positions we cannot perceive, but maintaining a presence that the ancient texts themselves seem to hint at when read with careful attention. Because scattered throughout the Mesopotamian record and preserved in traditions that branched off into other cultures are references to those who stayed, to watchers and guardians and shepherds who did not ascend with the others but chose or were assigned to remain. And the Book of Enoch, that strange apocalyptic text preserved by Ethiopian Christianity but rejected by most Western biblical canons, speaks extensively of beings called the Watchers. The Grigori in Greek translation angels or divine beings sent to observe humanity who became entangled with human affairs in ways that troubled the heavenly council. And according to Enoch, some of these watchers were punished and bound beneath the earth, while others remained at their posts, continuing their observation through the millennia. And this concept of divine observers who never fully departed appears across a remarkable range of traditions. In medieval Europe, the common folk spoke of encounters with luminous beings, angels who appeared in fields and forests, sometimes offering guidance, sometimes simply watching, and the Church documented thousands of such encounters while simultaneously trying to fit them into acceptable theological frameworks. And alongside these angelic visitations ran a parallel tradition, the fairy faith of Ireland and Scotland, and Wales and Brittany, which spoke of beings who lived in hollow hills and underground realms. Beings of great power and ancient knowledge who had once walked openly among humans but had retreated to hidden places. And folklorists have long noted the striking similarities between fairy encounters and both angelic visitations and modern accounts of contact with non-human entities. The same luminosity, the same sense of time distortion, the same mixture of wonder and terror, the same insistence from the beings that they have always been here, watching, waiting, and indigenous traditions across the world speak of similar presences. The Hopi preserved teachings about the ant people who sheltered humanity underground during times of catastrophe and who still maintain their subterranean realms, accessible only to those who know the proper ways. And Tibetan tradition speaks of Shambhala and Agartha, the underground kingdoms where enlightened beings preserve ancient wisdom, and South American traditions describe cities beneath the Andes, where the ancient teachers retreated when the surface world became too chaotic. And what are we to make of this global pattern, this recurring insistence that some of the old ones never left, that they simply withdrew from open interaction and continued their watch from hidden positions? And the question becomes even more pressing when we consider what has been happening in our own time, because something has shifted in the past several decades, something that governments can no longer easily dismiss. And on December 16th, 2017, the New York Times published an article that changed the terms of an old debate, revealing that the Pentagon had maintained a secret program to investigate unidentified aerial phenomena, that military pilots had captured footage of objects performing maneuvers that our understanding of physics cannot explain, objects that accelerated instantaneously to hypersonic speeds, that changed direction without any apparent deceleration, that seemed to ignore inertia and gravity and all the forces that constrain our own technology. And in the years since that initial disclosure, the revelations have continued. Congressional hearings have brought military personnel to testify under oath about encounters with craft that displayed capabilities we cannot replicate. The United States government has officially acknowledged that unidentified objects are operating in our airspace and that we do not know what they are or where they come from. And similar admissions have emerged from governments around the world, from military officials who spent careers dismissing such reports, now acknowledging that something is there, something is real, something demands explanation, and the physical characteristics described in these modern encounters carry echoes of the ancient texts, objects that glow with intense light, like the Melamu radiance described in Mesopotamian literature, craft that move in complete silence like the divine vessels of old, beings associated with these craft, who are described in terms remarkably similar to the ancient descriptions of the Anunnaki and their subordinates: tall, luminous, possessing technology that seems magical because it is so far beyond our own, and correlation is not causation. Patterns can emerge from coincidence, and the human mind is wired to find connections even where none exist. All of this is true and must be acknowledged. But the patterns persist regardless of our caution. The same descriptions appearing across 5,000 years of human testimony, the same physical characteristics, the same behavioral patterns, the same sense that we are being observed by something that has been here far longer than our current civilization. And if the ancient texts describe beings who departed in panic, who fled from something approaching, who left Earth in haste around 12,000 years ago, then we must ask whether whatever threatened them has passed, whether the cosmic danger they perceived has moved on, whether the conditions that drove them away have changed, and, if so, are the increasing sightings of our modern-era scouts, preliminary investigations, a gradual return beginning after millennia of absence or cautious distance. And what would they find if they returned fully, because the humanity they left behind was primitive by any technological measure? We could barely work metal. We had no writing. We had no cities. We were the experiment they had created, dependent on them for guidance and organization. But the humanity that exists now has split the atom, has walked on the moon, has decoded the structure of DNA, has created artificial minds that can process information in ways that rival biological intelligence. We are not the same species in any meaningful cultural sense. We have become something they may not have anticipated, and this raises questions that have no comfortable answers. If the Anunnaki were our creators, if they designed us for specific purposes, if they built limitations into our biology to keep us manageable, how would they respond to what we have become? Would they see us as a successful experiment, their creation having exceeded expectations, or would they see us as the very threat they feared? The reason they implemented controls in the first place, a species that has slipped its constraints and developed powers that make us potential rivals rather than obedient servants. And there is another question beneath this one, more uncomfortable still. If they are returning, if the modern phenomena represent the beginning of renewed contact, do we want them back? We have built our own civilizations now, imperfect and struggling, but our own. We have developed our own sciences and arts and philosophies. We have fought our way to whatever understanding we have achieved, and there is a dignity in that struggle, a meaning in having done it ourselves, even if we had help we no longer remember, even if the foundations were laid by others. The structure we have built upon them is ours. And what would it mean to have the original architects return, to have them resume authority over a project they abandoned, to have them explain or judge or guide or constrain what we have become in their absence? These are not questions with answers. Not tonight. Not in this contemplative space between waking and sleep. They are questions to hold gently, to turn over in the mind like smooth stones. Feeling their weight without demanding they reveal their centers. Because the truth is, we do not know. We cannot know from the evidence available to us whether the ancient departure was complete or partial, whether watchers remained or the old texts simply imagined them, whether modern phenomena are connected to ancient accounts or represent something else entirely. whether return is occurring or has already occurred or will never happen. We are left with patterns and possibilities, with questions that have haunted humanity since the first scribes pressed their styluses into wet clay and recorded the stories they had heard from the generation before them. And perhaps that not knowing is itself significant. Perhaps we are meant to wonder rather than to be certain. Perhaps the uncertainty is part of the design, or part of the test, or simply part of being human in a cosmos far stranger and more populated than we once assumed. Let these questions rest now. Let them settle into the quiet spaces of your mind as your breathing deepens and your body grows heavy. You do not need to solve these mysteries tonight. You need only to have touched them, to have felt their texture, to have joined the long lineage of humans who have looked at the stars and wondered who else might be looking back. And now we return to where we began, to the ruins of Eridu rising from the southern Iraqi plain. But the light has changed since we first stood here together at the edge of this ancient world. The fierce sun of midday has softened into the amber glow of evening, and the shadows have lengthened across the crumbled ziggurat platforms where priests once climbed toward heaven, where the god Enki once walked among his creation. If the tablets speak truth and the first stars are beginning to emerge in the deepening blue overhead, the same stars that the Sumerian astronomers tracked with such precision, the same stars that the Anunnaki supposedly descended from and returned to, the same stars that have watched this temple for 7,000 years, without offering any answers to the questions pressed into clay by scribes who wondered exactly what we wonder now. Let your breathing slow as the desert cools around you. Feel the temperature dropping as it does in these arid places when the sun withdraws. Notice how the silence here is not empty, but somehow full, pregnant with everything that has happened in this place and everything that might yet be understood. The archaeological teams have left for the day, their careful brushes and measuring tools packed away until morning, but the work continues even in their absence because the earth itself is an archive, and every grain of sand that shifts reveals another fragment of the story we have been tracing tonight. The ziggurat foundations before you are made of mud brick and bitumen, the same materials the texts describe the gods teaching humanity to use. And though the upper levels have crumbled into mounds that barely hint at their former glory, the base remains, layer upon layer of human effort, dedicated to maintaining a connection with beings who one day simply stopped responding. Imagine the last priest who climbed these steps expecting an oracle that never came. Imagine the generation that realized the gods were not returning tomorrow or next month or next year. Imagine the weight of that silence settling over this city like dust, like the sediment of abandoned faith. And yet, they kept the temples open, kept the rituals functioning, kept the tablets copied and preserved. They passed their confusion forward through time, hoping that someday someone would understand what they could not, and perhaps that someone is you. Perhaps that someone is this moment. Perhaps the very act of wondering is the answer they were waiting for. The stones beneath your feet have witnessed everything. The descent, if it happened, the teaching, if it occurred, the flourishing of the first human civilization under divine guidance. If the texts describe reality and then the departure, the panic. If our interpretation is correct, the hasty gathering of divine belongings, the final instructions given to confused human servants, the rising of the gods into whatever craft or dimension or cosmic mechanism carried them away from the experiment they had tended for so long. These stones remember even if they cannot speak, and sometimes standing in ancient places, you can feel that memory pressing against the thin membrane that separates past from present, fact from story, the literal from the mythological. Let your body grow heavier now. Feel yourself sinking into the earth as evening deepens toward night. The same earth that holds the bones of those first priests. The same earth that preserves the tablets we have been reading together. The same earth that witnessed the departure and has been waiting patiently for whatever comes next. What do we carry with us from this place, from this long journey through Sumerian tablets and Babylonian astronomy and global flood myths, and the strange persistent story of gods who came and taught and then fled in fear of something we still do not fully understand? Perhaps we carry it in our very cells, if the texts are to be believed. If the creation accounts describe actual genetic engineering rather than poetic metaphor, then every human alive today contains fragments of that ancient experiment. The divine blood mixed with earthly clay, the careful modifications made by Enki and Ninhursag to produce a worker species capable of understanding complex instructions. Population geneticists have mapped our ancestry with increasing precision, and they find strange things. Bottlenecks where human numbers crashed to mere thousands. Sudden expansions that suggest the introduction of advantageous traits. Patterns that do not quite fit the smooth curves of conventional evolutionary theory. The younger Dryas boundary layer that we discussed earlier shows not just platinum spikes and nanodiamonds, but a dramatic reduction in human genetic diversity, as if something reduced our species to a tiny remnant that then rebuilt. Perhaps with help, perhaps with guidance, perhaps with the genetic modifications that the texts describe as new limitations, shortened lifespans, reduced fertility, the constraints the gods imposed after the flood to keep their creation manageable. We carry something in our blood that science has not fully explained. Call it junk DNA or intergenic sequences, or whatever technical language helps maintain the illusion of understanding. But within those long stretches of genetic code that seem to serve no purpose, there might be information, instruction, legacy from whoever or whatever shaped us in those distant laboratories of creation. And even if you reject the literal interpretation entirely, even if you maintain that the texts are purely mythological and the genetic anomalies have mundane explanations, you still carry the cultural legacy of this ancient encounter. Every religion that awaits returning saviors, every mythology that speaks of gods descending and teaching and departing, every apocalyptic expectation of divine intervention at the end of an age. These patterns flow through human civilization like an underground river, surfacing in different places and times, but always carrying the same essential message. They were here, they left, they will return. Something in human consciousness keeps generating this story regardless of culture or continent. The departed teachers, the abandoned children, the long waiting, the promised return. We carry the waiting itself, encoded not in genes, but in the very structure of our religious and mythological imagination. And perhaps that waiting is not pathology, but memory, not wish fulfillment, but inheritance, not fantasy, but the echo of something that actually occurred so long ago that only story could preserve it. The Sumerians wrote it down because writing had just been invented, and they could finally fix the oral traditions in permanent form. But the traditions themselves were already ancient by then, already blurred by generations of retelling, already mythologized into the forms we struggle to decode. And yet, the core persists. The arrival, the teaching, the growing tension, the departure in haste, the silence that followed and has never fully ended. Perhaps we are meant to remember this, meant to carry the story forward until the return that the texts promise. Or perhaps we are meant to transcend it, meant to become what our creators intended or feared, meant to take our place among the stars ourselves, rather than waiting for others to descend from them. The responsibility of inheriting such mysteries is not to solve them definitively, but to hold them with appropriate wonder, to neither dismiss them as primitive fantasy, nor accept them as literal history without evidence, but to dwell in the uncertainty, to let the questions remain open, to pass them forward as the ancient scribes passed them to us. Your eyelids are heavy now, and that is as it should be. The night has fully arrived at Eridu, and the desert stars blaze overhead with a brightness rarely seen in our light-polluted modern world. And your body knows what your mind has been moving toward all evening: the descent into sleep, into dream, into the other world that ancients believed was no less real than waking, only differently real, differently accessible, differently true. In Mesopotamian tradition, dreams were messages from the gods, doorways through which the divine could still communicate, even with those who had never seen a god with waking eyes. And perhaps tonight, as you drift into whatever dreams await, you will find yourself in that ancient landscape, walking the processional way toward the ziggurat, hearing the chanting of priests who have been dead for 5,000 years, seeing the lights that the texts describe descending from heaven. Dreams do not require proof, do not demand evidence, do not submit to the scholarly apparatus we have been deploying all evening. They simply are. They simply come. They simply reveal whatever they choose to reveal and leave the interpretation to the waking mind that barely remembers them by morning. Let yourself fall now. Let the questions we have raised tonight fall with you, not as weights, but as companions, not as problems requiring solution, but as mysteries worth inhabiting. The scribes who pressed stylus into clay 5,000 years ago are somehow still present in this liminal space between consciousness and dream. The gods they served, whether real or imagined, literal or metaphorical, still cast their shadow across human expectation. The silence they left still rings with possibility rather than mere absence. You do not need answers tonight. You need only the peace of having asked, the satisfaction of having traced these patterns through ancient texts and modern evidence, and the strange territory where they overlap. The story continues, whether you are awake to hear it or not, continues in the archaeological digs that will resume tomorrow morning, continues in the translation work of scholars bent over tablets in museum basements, continues in the genetic research mapping patterns that do not quite fit our expectations, continues in the telescope scanning skies for objects that move in ways our physics cannot explain. You are part of this story now, having traveled so far into its depths, and even as sleep claims you, the story carries on, patient as the stones of Eridu, ancient as the stars overhead, waiting as we have always been waiting for whatever comes next. If this journey has meant something to you, If these questions have found a home in your wondering mind, a quiet acknowledgement, a gentle like helps other seekers find their way to these same ruins, these same tablets, these same beautiful uncertainties that make human existence so much richer than mere certainty could ever provide. Breathe deeply now and let the last tension leave your body. Now feel yourself held by the same earth that holds the temples and the tablets and the bones of all who came before, and know that you are not alone in wondering, never alone in asking. Part of a chain that stretches back to the first human who looked up at the stars and asked who put us here and where did they go. The waiting continues. The stars wheel slowly overhead as they have wheeled for billions of years. And somewhere in the vast silence between worlds, the story we have traced tonight either resolves into ordinary history or expands into something so much stranger and more wonderful than we have dared to imagine. And we may not learn which in our lifetimes. And that is somehow beautiful, somehow enough, somehow exactly what we need to carry us into sleep and through the dreams that wait like undiscovered tablets in the earth of our unconscious minds, pressing their cuneiform messages into the wet clay of our souls, waiting to be read when we are finally ready.